The morning Evelyn Fairchild fainted in the doorway of the Dusty Creek General Store. Nobody in town seemed to notice, except for a sun-bronzed cowboy who had been watching her grow thinner for weeks. Dusty Creek, Texas, sat at the edge of nowhere in the autumn of 1882, a raw and restless town carved out of red clay and ambition, where the railroad had just reached its eastern edge and everything smelled of sawdust, horse leather, and possibility. It was the kind of place where a woman alone was either pitied or forgotten, and Evelyn Fairchild had been doing everything in her power to ensure she was neither. She had come to Dusty Creek 6 months prior, following the death of her husband, Robert Fairchild, who had purchased a small parcel of land and a modest homestead on the western edge of town, before a fever took him 3 weeks after their arrival. He had been 34 years old and full of hope, and the cruelty of the frontier had swallowed him whole before he even had a chance to drive a fence post into the red Texas earth. Evelyn had buried him beneath a young cottonwood tree, stood over the mound of turned soil for a long time with her hands clasped and her dark hair loose around her shoulders, and then turned back toward the small wooden house and decided she would survive. Survival, she had learned quickly, was not the same thing as living. She was 26 years old, slender in the way that came from good breeding rather than hardship, with dark brown eyes that caught the light in a way that made people look twice, and a quiet composure that most of the townspeople mistook for coldness. She was not cold. She was simply determined not to fall apart in front of strangers. The land Robert had purchased came with a small vegetable garden, a half-broken fence, 2 chickens, and a well that ran inconsistently. The money he had brought west with him was largely spent on the land deed and the journey, and what remained was dwindling with an alarming steadiness that Evelyn charted in a small ledger book every Sunday evening by candlelight. She had taken on work as a seamstress, mending clothes and hemming dresses for the wives of merchants and ranchers, and she had applied for a position as a schoolteacher when the old schoolmaster, Mr. Hollies, had retired due to rheumatism. The school board was still deliberating, which was a polite way of saying they were uncomfortable hiring a widow woman of unknown virtue. In the meantime, she was careful with every penny and careless with her own needs. The garden had not produced what she had hoped. The chickens gave eggs intermittently. The well had gone dry in September, and she was hauling water from the creek 3 times a week in heavy wooden buckets. She had been skipping breakfast for nearly 2 months, telling herself a cup of chicory coffee was enough to start the day, and skipping supper 2 or 3 nights a week when her supplies ran low, and her pride refused to let her admit the severity of her situation to anyone in town. It was this slow, stubborn diminishment that Patrick Dawson had noticed before anyone else had thought to look. Patrick was 30 years old, tall and raw-boned with sun-darkened skin and dark blue eyes that were the color of the sky just before a storm rolled in from the north. He worked for the Cowboy Ranch, the largest cattle operation within 50 miles of Dusty Creek, serving as one of their senior hands. He was not the foreman, though Frank Calloway had offered him the position twice. Patrick had a reputation for being dependable, honest to a fault, and possessed of a quiet kind of decency that was rarer on the frontier than silver or water. He had first seen Evelyn Fairchild at the general store run by Harold and Mabel Greer the week after her husband's funeral, when she had come in to buy flour and salt, and had counted out her coins on the counter with the kind of careful precision that told him she was counting every one. He had thought about her after that, not in any particular way, just noticed her the way you notice something that does not quite fit the hard geometry of frontier life. She was too fine-boned for this place, too carefully held together, like a piece of good china sitting on a rough-hewn shelf. He saw her at the store again 2 weeks later, and then again after that, and he began to notice the pattern of what she was buying and what she was not buying: small amounts of flour, a little cornmeal, salt pork when it was deeply discounted, never anything extra. He began to notice her cheekbones more prominently each time, the slight hollowness around her eyes, The way her dress, which had once fit her well, was beginning to hang from her shoulders. He noticed the way she walked past the bakery on Main Street without going in, even when the smell of fresh bread was strong enough to make a grown man's mouth water. He noticed the way she sometimes stood at the edge of the market day vendors with an expression on her face that was politely neutral but that held, if you knew how to read it, a kind of quiet longing. Patrick was not the kind of man who made assumptions or inserted himself into situations uninvited. He had been raised by his mother in Missouri, a woman who had told him that observing was not the same as caring, and that the measure of a person was not what they noticed but what they did about it. He had carried that principle with him through cattle drives and harsh winters, and the thousand small difficulties of life on the frontier. So when he saw Evelyn nearly collapse against the doorframe of Greer's General Store on a bright October morning, catching herself with one hand on the painted wood and standing still for a moment with her eyes closed while the color drained from her face, Patrick Dawson made a decision. He was across the street in a few long strides, and he was beside her before she fully registered his presence. "Ma'am," he said, keeping his voice low and even, "you ought to sit down." Evelyn opened her eyes and looked at him with an expression that was equal parts mortification and sheer stubbornness. He recognized her, of course, and she recognized him in the vague way of recognizing someone you have seen around a small town without ever having spoken to them directly. "I am perfectly fine," she said, which was clearly untrue, and they both knew it. "All the same," Patrick said. He did not touch her, did not reach for her arm, just positioned himself steadily beside her in a way that made it clear he was not going anywhere. "It is warm this morning, and you have been on your feet for a good while." He had not actually seen her this morning before this moment, but he had seen her the 2 mornings before, walking into town from her homestead, which was a little over a mile from Main Street, carrying a basket of mending for delivery. The walk alone in the heat would exhaust anyone who had not eaten enough. Evelyn straightened her spine. There was something in the gesture that Patrick recognized as deeply ingrained habit, the kind of posture a woman holds onto when everything else is uncertain. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Dawson," he said. "Patrick Dawson. I work out at the Callaway spread." "Mr. Dawson," she said, with a small nod that was almost formal. "I am Evelyn Fairchild." "And I truly am fine." "Yes, ma'am," he said agreeably. He did not argue, he simply held his ground. "Would you allow me to carry your basket as far as Greer's door? I am heading in that direction myself." She looked at him for a moment with those steady dark eyes, weighing something. Then she handed him the basket, which was heavier than it looked, and they walked the 3 remaining feet to the store entrance together. Inside the cool dimness of the store, Mabel Greer looked up from behind the counter with sharp, observant eyes. She was a stout woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and the particular alertness of someone who knew everything that happened in her town. She had been watching Evelyn Fairchild's grocery purchases for weeks with growing concern, but had not said anything because Evelyn was too proud for pity and Mabel respected that. Patrick set the basket down and tipped his hat to Mabel. "Mrs. Greer, good morning." "Good morning, Patrick," Mabel said, with a tone that suggested she had observed the exchange outside and found it interesting. He turned back to Evelyn. "Would you take a glass of water before you go, Mrs. Fairchild? It would ease the walk back." It was such a simple, practical offer, made without drama or condescension, that Evelyn found she could not refuse it. She sat down on the barrel stool near the counter that Mabel kept for elderly customers, and Mabel produced a tin cup of cool water from the barrel in back, and nobody said anything about why she had nearly fainted in the doorway, which was a mercy that Evelyn appreciated deeply. Patrick bought the feed he had come for, exchanged a few words with Harold Greer about the state of the roads after the recent rains, and was gone within 10 minutes. He did not make a fuss. He did not offer money or food or condescending advice. He simply made sure she was sitting down and had water before he left. But that night, sitting in his bunk at the Callaway bunkhouse, while his fellow hands played cards by lamplight, Patrick thought about Evelyn Fairchild and the precise mathematics of how thin a person could get before the body simply gave out. He had seen it happen on cattle drives, seen men who pushed themselves past hunger into a kind of gray endurance that was one bad day from catastrophe. He thought about it for a long time, and then he made a plan. He rose early the next morning, before the sun had cleared the horizon, and went to the cookhouse where Big Tom, the ranch cook, was already starting the day's bread. Patrick and Big Tom had a good understanding, built on years of Patrick being the man who always complimented the cooking and always cleaned his plate. He explained, without going into more detail than was necessary, that he needed some extra provisions to leave at a homestead on the western edge of town, and he was willing to pay for them out of his own wages. Big Tom, who was a perceptive man under his large and cheerful exterior, asked no questions. He packed up a cloth sack with half a loaf of the morning's bread, still warm, a paper twist of salt pork, a handful of dried beans, and 2 early apples from the ranch's small orchard. He handed it to Patrick and waved away the offer of payment. Patrick rode into town before the rest of the ranch hands were stirring, left his horse at the edge of Evelyn's property, and walked quietly up to the front door of her small homestead. It was a modest structure, better kept than he had expected, with a swept porch and a carefully tended window box that held the last stubborn marigolds of the season. He set the cloth sack on the porch boards just to the right of the door, where she would see it the moment she stepped outside. Then he walked back to his horse and rode out before the sun was fully up, without once knocking on the door or announcing himself. Evelyn found the sack when she opened her door at 6:30, and she stood on her porch for a long time looking at it with her arms crossed over her chest and a complicated expression on her face. The bread was still faintly warm through the cloth. There was no note, no indication of who had left it. She thought about Robert, who had been a practical and generous man, and how he would have simply accepted help without making it a philosophical question. She thought about her own stubbornness, and the fact that she had drunk only black coffee that morning, and that her hands had a slight tremor she had been trying to ignore. She brought the sack inside and sat down at her kitchen table and ate bread with the salt pork, slowly and deliberately, and felt the gray unsteadiness of the last several weeks begin, incrementally, to lift. The same thing happened the next morning. Another cloth sack on the porch. This time it contained cornmeal, a small jar of preserved peaches, and a generous wedge of hard cheese. Again, no note, no indication of a sender, and the morning after that. Dried beans and a good piece of smoked ham and a small paper bag of coffee. Actual coffee, not chicory. This made Evelyn's throat tighten unexpectedly because coffee was expensive, and whoever had left this had gone to some trouble. She began to watch from her window in the early mornings, wrapped in her shawl in the blue pre-dawn light, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever was doing this. She did not have to wait long. On the 4th morning she saw a tall figure on horseback at the edge of her land, a dark shape against the lightning sky, and something in the way he moved, the particular economy of motion in dismounting and walking, told her it was Patrick Dawson before she could have named any specific feature. She felt a warmth move through her that was not quite like anything she could readily name. She did not confront him immediately. She was not sure why. Perhaps because doing so would change something about the quiet, careful way this had been happening, and she was not ready for that change. She watched him set the sack on her porch and walk back to his horse with the unhurried dignity of a man who was doing something he had decided was right and required no acknowledgement, and she thought that she had not met many people of that particular quality. She ate her breakfast that morning with the window open and the cool October air coming in, and she felt, for the first time since Robert's death, something that was tentatively approaching hope. It was Mabel Greer who finally brought them together properly, which surprised no one who knew Mabel. She organized a harvest social at the end of October, which was an annual tradition in Dusty Creek that involved most of the town gathering in the yard behind the church, with long tables set up and everyone bringing something to share. It was one of those frontier rituals that served multiple purposes simultaneously. It was a celebration, a practical exchange of resources before winter, and a social occasion that allowed people who were normally too busy surviving to actually speak to one another. Evelyn had debated not going. Her natural instinct, sharpened by months of isolation and loss, was to stay home and mend a pile of shirts by candlelight. But she had finished the bread Patrick had left that morning and felt stronger than she had in weeks, and something pulled at her, some stubborn desire to be present in the world rather than simply enduring it. She wore her best dress, a dark blue wool with white collar and cuffs that she had cleaned and pressed carefully, and pinned her hair up in a way that she had not done since before Robert got sick. The walk into town felt easier than it had in months, and she told herself it was the cooler weather. The social was already well underway when she arrived, the yard strung with paper lanterns that glowed amber and gold in the early evening air, the tables loaded with everything from roasted corn to dried apple pies to the extravagant luxury of someone's molasses cake. The sound of a fiddle cut through the cool air, and children were chasing each other between the tables while their parents talked and laughed and filled their plates. Evelyn stood at the edge of it all for a moment, feeling the familiar weight of her aloneness, and then Mabel Greer materialized at her elbow with the supernatural swiftness of a woman who had been watching for her arrival. "Evelyn, you look wonderful," Mabel said firmly, in the tone of someone making a declaration. "Come with me, I want to introduce you to some people." She was propelled through the crowd with gentle but irresistible force, and introduced to the sheriff's wife, to the new school board chairman's daughter, to a rancher's wife from outside town who was also relatively new to the area, and to various other people who turned out to be perfectly pleasant. By the time Mabel steered her toward the group standing near the apple barrel, Evelyn had almost relaxed. Patrick was there, standing with two other cowboys from the Calloway ranch, a tin cup in his hand, talking in the quiet way he seemed to do everything. He saw her when Mabel brought her over, and something shifted in his expression. It was not dramatic. It was simply the look of a man seeing something that he had been thinking about without quite admitting it. "Patrick Dawson," Mabel said with magnificent casualness. "You've met Mrs. Fairchild, haven't you? She's been doing wonderful work on the mending for half the town, and she's waiting on the school board to make up their minds, which Lord knows they should have done by now." "We have met," Patrick said, and looked at Evelyn directly. "Mrs. Fairchild, good evening." "Good evening, Mr. Dawson," Evelyn said, and there was a moment between them that was very quiet and very full. The two Calloway hands, reading the situation with the instinctive diplomacy of men who spent too many months in close quarters with each other, suddenly remembered something they needed to do elsewhere and disappeared with admirable efficiency. Mabel, her mission accomplished, moved away toward another cluster of people with the serene satisfaction of a woman who knows she has done good work. Evelyn looked at Patrick Dawson in the warm lantern light and decided to say the thing she had been carrying for a week. "I believe I owe you a thank you," she said, "for the provisions." He met her gaze steadily. "I do not know what you are referring to." "I think you do," she said, not unkindly, just honest. A small pause. Then he said quietly, "You needed them." "I did," she admitted, and the admission cost her something. She could feel it, but it was also a relief. The way setting down a heavy basket was a relief even when you had not fully acknowledged how heavy it had got. "I am proud, Mr. Dawson. Probably too proud for my own good, but I want you to know that it mattered, very much." "I am glad," he said simply. They stood together in the lantern light for a moment, and then Patrick said, "Would you like some of the molasses cake before it is all gone? It looked exceptional." Evelyn laughed, and the sound surprised her, coming from somewhere she had thought was sealed shut. "I would like that very much," she said. They sat at the end of one of the long tables with plates of cake and mugs of warm cider and talked for over an hour. She learned that he had come to Texas from Missouri 8 years ago, following an older brother who had since returned east. She learned that he had been on 3 major cattle drives along the Kishom Trail and had no particular desire to do another, that he was saving money toward his own land, that he read when he could get books, and that he had grown up with a mother who kept a large vegetable garden and considered growing food to be a form of dignity. He learned that she had grown up in Ohio, the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had died when Evelyn was 12, that she had met Robert Fairchild when he was a traveling goods salesman passing through her town, that she had been 23 when they married, and that she had loved him in the particular way you love someone who is kind and steady, and that his death had left her not just grieving but genuinely stranded. Because the plan for their life had been his, and she had not yet had a chance to develop her own. She told him about the school board deliberation and the particular irritation of sitting in limbo while older men decided whether she was suitable. Patrick's expression when she described this had a controlled quality that told her he had opinions about it that he was keeping civil. "You have a teaching certificate?" he asked. "I have my father's teaching certificate and the benefit of 20 years of watching a good teacher work, and a natural inclination toward it, and 5 years of tutoring experience," she said, "which I believe is more than sufficient." "More than sufficient," he agreed, and the certainty in his voice made her feel unexpectedly grateful. When the social began to wind down and people started drifting homeward, Patrick walked her to the edge of town, where the road turned toward her homestead. He did not try to walk her all the way home. He seemed to understand that would have been too much, too fast. He stopped at the turning point and said good night with a formality that was not distant but simply respectful. "Mrs. Fairchild," he said, "I will be in town day after tomorrow for feed. Would you allow me to carry your mending deliveries? It would save you the wait." She considered him for a moment in the moonlight. He was very tall and very steady, and he was looking at her in a way that was careful and warm and entirely honest. "I would allow that," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Dawson." She walked home in the cool October night and felt the world around her as something other than purely hostile for the first time in a long time. True to his word, he appeared at her door 2 mornings later, hat in hand, and carried the basket of mending into town while she walked beside him, and they talked with the ease of people who had already gotten through the awkward early business and arrived at something more comfortable. He came again the following week, and then it became a regular thing, not arranged explicitly, just understood, that when she had deliveries and he was coming into town, he would stop at her homestead and they would walk together. The provisions continued to appear on her porch every morning, though now that it was acknowledged between them it had a different quality, less mysterious and more simply generous. She began to leave a note on the porch sometimes when she left for early deliveries, just a small practical accounting of what she was running low on, and he began to adjust what he brought accordingly. It was a quiet, functional kind of communication that felt, to both of them, like something important. November came to Dusty Creek with an iron determination, the temperature dropping sharply, and the sky taking on the particular pewter quality of a plains winter coming on. Evelyn's well had been repaired by a traveling plumber in late October, which removed one burden, but the cold brought new challenges. Her firewood supply was inadequate and her house, which was not particularly well built, let the wind through in ways that Robert had intended to fix and never gotten to. She was dealing with this one evening, stuffing rags into the gaps around the window frames, when she heard a knock at her door. It was Patrick, with 2 of the Calloway ranch's younger hands, and between them they had a cord of split firewood in a wagon. "We were cutting wood at the ranch and had surplus," Patrick said, which was not entirely untrue but was also not the complete story, and they both knew it. It would save hauling it back. The 2 younger hands unloaded the wood with quick efficiency, stacking it neatly against the side of the house, and departed with cheerful waves. Patrick stayed on the porch, and Evelyn looked at him with that direct gaze of hers that had come, over the past several weeks, to feel like one of his favorite things. "Patrick," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name and they both noticed it. "You are very kind." "It is just wood," he said, but his voice had changed slightly, become quieter. "It is not just wood," she said. "It has not been just wood since the first morning." He held her gaze for a moment, and then he said, "No, it has not." The cold air moved between them, and neither of them moved away from it. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" she asked. "I have the real kind, as you know." He smiled, and it changed his whole face, made the seriousness of it lighter and younger, and Evelyn felt something pull in her chest that was unmistakable. "I would like that," he said. "Yes." They sat at her small kitchen table and drank coffee in the lamplight while the wind moved around the house outside, and the conversation went further than it had before. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about his father who had been a difficult and unhappy man, about his mother who had taught him to work a garden and treat people decently. She told him about the particular loneliness of being 12 years old and motherless in a small Ohio town, about the books that had saved her, about the way her father had always told her that an educated mind was the only thing nobody could take away from you. "He sounds like a good man," Patrick said. "He was the best man I knew," she said. Until recently. She had not planned to say that last part. It came out with the natural ease of something true, and she felt the heat rise in her face immediately after. Patrick looked at his coffee cup for a moment, and then he looked up at her, and there was something open and vulnerable in his expression that she had not expected from him, though perhaps she should have. "Mrs. Fairchild," he said carefully. "Evelyn," she said. "Evelyn," he said, and her name in his voice had a quality she had not heard before and found she wanted to hear again. "I am not a man who speaks easily about things that matter to him. I find it comes out in other ways." "I have noticed," she said softly. "But I would like to speak plainly now, if that is acceptable to you." "Please," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I think about you considerably more than is explained by neighborly concern. I think about whether you are warm enough and whether you have eaten and whether the school board is going to do the right thing. And I think about the way you laugh, which you do not do often enough, and the way you look when you are reading, which I have seen through your window a few times while passing, and I am aware that is a great deal of things to be thinking about someone." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "Patrick," she said, "you have been leaving provisions on my porch every morning for 4 weeks. I think we are well past the point where you need to worry about speaking plainly." He looked at her, and then he laughed, a short, genuine sound that was not something she had heard from him before, and it was good. "I suppose we are," he said. "I think about you as well," she said, "more than is explained by gratitude." The lamplight held them both in its warm circle, and outside the wind was cold and the plains were wide and indifferent and dark. But inside the small kitchen it was warm and the coffee was good, and something had begun between them that felt like the most solid thing either of them had encountered in a very long time. He did not kiss her that evening. He finished his coffee and put on his hat and said good night with a formality that was entirely undermined by the look in his eyes, which was warm and certain, and something close to joy. She stood in her doorway and watched him ride away into the November dark and pressed her hand briefly against the doorframe and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was not afraid. The school board made their decision the following week. Evelyn was called to meet with the chairman, a heavy-set man named Archibald Finch, who had the particular quality of being both self-important and genuinely uncertain, and was informed that she would be offered the position of schoolteacher beginning in January, at a salary of $30 per month, contingent on satisfactory performance at the end of the spring term. $30 a month was not a fortune, but it was security, which was better. She walked out of Archibald Finch's office on Main Street and stood on the wooden sidewalk in the gray November air and felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from the sheer accumulated relief of having something secure at last. She went directly to Greer's General Store to tell Mabel, who hugged her with the enthusiastic force of someone who had been expecting this news and had opinions about how long it had taken. Then she sent a message to the Calloway ranch with a boy who ran errands for Harold Greer, just a short note that read, "The school board has decided. January. Thought you would want to know. E.F. Patrick appeared at her door that same evening with a bottle of good brandy that he had clearly purchased in something of a hurry based on the way he was slightly out of breath. "Congratulations," he said when she opened the door. She looked at him, at the bottle of brandy and the slightly wind-blown state of him and the enormous quiet happiness in his face, and she thought, with a definiteness that settled in her bones, that she was falling in love with this man. "Come in," she said. "We will celebrate properly." They did. They sat by the fire she had built with the wood he had brought, drank brandy from her two mismatched glasses, and she told him everything about the meeting with Archibald Finch, including the pompous way he had phrased the offer, and Patrick listened and laughed in the right places, and was indignant on her behalf in the right places. And it was, she realized, the best evening she had spent in longer than she could readily calculate. At some point the conversation shifted, the way conversations do when two people have had a small amount of brandy and are warm and comfortable, and Patrick said, quietly, "What do you want, Evelyn? Beyond the teaching position, what do you want for yourself?" It was such a direct question and so rare, she thought, for someone to ask it, particularly for someone to ask a woman in 1882 Texas what she wanted for herself, as if the answer genuinely mattered. She thought about it honestly. "I want to stay," she said. "I thought when Robert died that I would go back east, back to Ohio, but I have found that I do not want to. Something in this place has gotten into me. The space of it. The way the sky looks in the evening. I want to be here, and I want the teaching, and I want the garden to actually work this time, and I want—" She stopped. "What else?" he asked. She met his gaze. "I want to not be alone anymore," she said. "I was not made for aloneness the way some people are." Patrick was quiet for a moment, and then he reached across the small table and covered her hand with his, very lightly, just letting his hand rest there. "You do not have to be," he said. She turned her hand over and let her fingers rest against his palm. They stayed like that for a little while, not needing to say anything more. December unfolded with a steady and increasingly comfortable intimacy that the whole town of Dusty Creek observed with the collective interest that small towns apply to such developments. Patrick had taken to coming by the homestead 2 or 3 evenings a week, ostensibly to help with various practical tasks, mending the fence, reinforcing the walls against the cold, repairing the henhouse so the chickens would stop escaping, but in practice to sit at Evelyn's kitchen table and drink coffee and talk for hours about anything and everything. He brought her books when he could get them, trading with the circuit preacher who had a good collection of novels and did not object to lending them out. She read them quickly and returned them with detailed opinions, and he would listen to her describe what she had read with the particular quality of attention he gave her that always made her feel like the most interesting person in the room. Mabel Greer, who missed nothing, told her husband Harold that it was about time, and Harold agreed with the ease of a man who knew better than to disagree with Mabel on matters of the heart. On a Saturday in mid-December, Patrick took Evelyn for a ride out to the western edge of the Calloway land, to a rise that looked out over the plains in a way that showed you why people had come to this country in the first place. The day was cold but clear, the sky enormous and blue above them, the grass the color of old gold, and in the distance the hills were hazy and blue-gray. They sat on their horses side by side and looked at it in silence for a while. "I have been looking at land," Patrick said. "About 3 miles north of your homestead, 120 acres, good grass, a reliable spring, old farmhouse that needs work." Evelyn looked at him. "It is a good price," he said, "because of the work it needs. I have enough saved for the deed. The rest is labor." She understood what he was not quite saying yet. She could feel it in the stillness between them, the same quality as the moment before rain when everything holds. "It sounds like a good piece of land," she said carefully. He turned and looked at her directly. The cold had put color in his face, and his eyes were that particular dark blue against the pale winter sky. "Evelyn," he said, I am not a man with a great deal of eloquence, but I love you. I have been trying to find the right moment to say that plainly, and I believe that moment is now. With all this, he gestured at the sky and the grass and the vast wide country around them. As a witness. She felt her throat close with the particular tightness of strong emotion, the good kind. I love you, he continued, the way I have loved very little in my life, which is to say completely and without reservation, and I would like, if you are willing, to ask you properly to be my wife. But I wanted to tell you I love you first, separately, because I think it should be said on its own. Evelyn looked at Patrick Dawson in the vast winter light of the Texas plains and felt every piece of herself that had been braced and defended and carefully held together for the last 6 months begin, slowly and with enormous relief, to soften. I love you, she said. I have been loving you since you left bread on my porch without knocking, which I thought at the time was the most quietly heroic thing I had ever seen. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, Will you marry me, Evelyn Fairchild? Yes, she said, without hesitation. Patrick Dawson, yes. He reached out and took her hand, even through the gloves, and held it firmly, and she held his back, and they sat on horseback on the rise looking out over the plains of Texas, while the cold December wind moved around them, and neither of them felt particularly cold. He rode into town that afternoon to speak to the circuit judge, who doubled as the county clerk, and Evelyn rode back to her homestead and sat at the kitchen table for a while with the particular stunned happiness of someone who has been given something they had stopped believing they deserved. She wrote a letter to her father in Ohio, which she had been doing infrequently and without enough detail, and told him she was well, she was secure, she was going to teach school in January, and she was going to be married in the spring to a man named Patrick Dawson, who was honest and good, and who had been leaving food on her porch before she was ready to ask for help. Her father wrote back 6 weeks later, via the February mail coach, with a letter that was 3 pages long and full of the particular warm emotion her father expressed in writing far more easily than in person, and which ended with the line, A man who feeds you without being asked is a man worth keeping, my dear. She kept that letter in her Bible, tucked between the pages. Christmas in Dusty Creek was a modest affair by Eastern standards, but it had its own particular beauty. Mabel Greer organized a church gathering that involved everyone in town who was not otherwise occupied, and the small church was warm with body heat and candlelight, and the singing was not always precise, but was always enthusiastic. Patrick arrived at Evelyn's homestead on Christmas morning with the provisions, which had continued through all of this, as if having declared his love and been accepted had not changed the fundamental nature of his care for her, and also with a small package wrapped in brown paper. She opened it at the kitchen table while he stood in the doorway, and inside was a volume of poetry by Alfred Lord Tennyson, with a small inscription on the inside front cover in his careful, slightly formal handwriting. For Evelyn, who deserves beautiful things. With love, Patrick. She looked at it for a moment, and then she got up and crossed the kitchen and kissed him for the first time properly, with her hands against his chest, and his hands coming up to hold her face with the gentleness of a man being careful with something precious. And it was very good. She had a gift for him as well, which she had made herself. A vest she had sewn from the good wool she had been saving, fitted to the measurements she had taken with a great deal of enjoyable subterfuge, dark brown with small brass buttons. He put it on over his shirt, and she looked at him in it with a satisfaction that was only partly the professional pride of a seamstress. They walked to the Christmas gathering together, which meant they arrived together, and the whole of Dusty Creek took note of this with the contained delight of a community that had been watching the situation develop and was pleased with the outcome. Mabel Greer caught Evelyn's hand at the church door and looked at her with sharp, warm eyes. You are happy, she said, as if confirming something. I am, Evelyn said. I truly am. Good, said Mabel firmly. That is exactly what should happen. The new year arrived with a genuine bite to it, the temperature dropping below freezing for a week straight in early January, which presented the very practical difficulty of keeping the schoolroom warm enough for children to learn in. Evelyn started her teaching position on the second Monday of January with 8 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, a drafty one-room schoolhouse, a good supply of chalk, and a determination that was impressive even by frontier standards. Patrick came by the schoolhouse on her first day to make sure the wood stove was drawing properly. He fixed a warped flue connection that had been causing problems, split enough wood to last a week, and stacked it by the door. He did all of this before the students arrived, so it would not undermine her authority, which was the kind of thing she was learning to love about him. The way he understood what she needed without being told. The children were not, collectively, the easiest group. There were 3 Murdoch siblings who had strong opinions about arithmetic, a very small boy named Charlie who cried during the first 3 days until Evelyn found that he was frightened of the bell and simply stopped ringing it, and a 14-year-old girl named Alice Prout, who had clearly been told that girls did not need more than basic letters and was quietly furious about it. Evelyn took Alice aside at the end of the first week and told her privately that she was the best student in the room and that Evelyn intended to teach her everything she knew, including mathematics and geography and American history, and that what she did with that knowledge was her own business, but the knowledge itself was hers to have. Alice looked at her with an expression that was all the fierce, suppressed longing of a young woman who had been underestimated, and said, "Yes, ma'am," with a conviction that was more like a declaration. Evelyn went home that Friday evening and told Patrick about it, and he listened with the full attention he always gave her and said, "She is lucky she has you." And Evelyn thought with a warm certainty that she was building something real in this place, something of her own. February brought 2 things: the announcement of their engagement at a gathering that Mabel Greer organized at the church hall, which was attended by most of the town and involved a great deal of cake, and the arrival of a man named Tom Grady at the Calloway Ranch. Tom Grady was one of those frontier characters who existed in the uncomfortable space between worker and troublemaker. He had come from somewhere in Oklahoma with a letter of recommendation from a ranch there, and was hired on as a new hand. He was broad and loud, and had an immediate and obvious interest in Evelyn Fairchild. That was the kind of interest that did not adjust itself in response to the information that she was engaged to be married. He appeared in front of her at the general store one afternoon in late February, while she was collecting the week's provisions, and made comments that were technically civil, but had a quality to them that she recognized immediately and found deeply tiresome. She handled it with a precision that Patrick would have admired if he had been there, which was to be extremely polite, extremely cool, and extremely clear, and then she went directly to Mabel Greer and told her, because Mabel knew everything about what went on in town and was a better ally than most. Patrick was told about it that evening when he came by, and the stillness that crossed his face was of a particular quality that she had not seen before and recognized as controlled anger. "I will speak to Frank Calloway," he said. "You do not need to fight anyone on my behalf," Evelyn said. "I handled it." "I know you did," he said immediately. "You are entirely capable of handling it." "I am not doubting that. But Grady is my colleague and my employer needs to know that he is conducting himself that way in town, because that reflects on the ranch, and because Frank Calloway is a fair man who will address it." This distinction mattered to her, that he was not moving to fight but to address, that he respected her ability to manage herself while still being willing to handle his side of things. "All right," she said. "That seems sensible." Frank Calloway spoke to Tom Grady the following morning, and Tom Grady, to his credit, seemed to absorb the message without requiring further intervention. He gave Evelyn a wide berth in town after that, and when his contract with the Calloway Ranch ended in April, he moved on to somewhere further west and was not particularly missed. The spring came to Dusty Creek with a rush of warmth and color that felt almost extravagant after the gray iron of winter. The cottonwood trees along the creek put out their pale green leaves, and the grass turned vivid, and the mornings had that particular quality of new beginnings that the Texas spring did better than anywhere else Evelyn had ever been. She had planted her garden in late March, this time with a better understanding of the soil, and with Patrick beside her on the 2 Saturdays, they spent together turning the earth and laying out the rows. He knew gardening in the way he knew most practical things, quietly and thoroughly, and she enjoyed working beside him with the ease of 2 people who had gotten good at being in each other's company. The wedding was set for the 3rd Saturday in April, and planned with the practical simplicity of 2 people who cared more about the substance of the thing than the ceremony. Mabel Greer, who had appointed herself the primary organizer, had other ideas about the simplicity, but Evelyn and Patrick managed to keep it from becoming overwhelming. The dress was made by Evelyn herself, naturally, from a good ivory cotton that Harold Greer had ordered in specially from San Antonio. She made it over 4 evenings while Patrick read aloud to her from the Tennyson he had given her at Christmas, sitting across the table while she sewed, his voice steady and warm in the lamplight. And it was one of the most deeply contented sequences of evenings she could remember. The ceremony was held in the small church on a brilliant Saturday morning, with the sky blazing blue and the cottonwoods flowering outside the windows. The preacher was the circuit preacher who had first sold Patrick the books, a lean man named Reverend Alcott who had a talent for the essential. Evelyn walked down the aisle on no one's arm, because she had decided that she had gotten herself to this point and would arrive under her own power. And then she stood at the front of the church and looked at Patrick Dawson, who was wearing his good suit and the vest she had made him, and looking at her with an expression of such concentrated love that she had to take a breath to steady herself. He reached out his hand and she took it. Reverend Alcott kept the ceremony simple and direct, as agreed, and when he asked Patrick to say his vows, Patrick said them in a quiet, certain voice that carried clearly through the church, and every word was the kind that landed in the chest and stayed there. "I love you, Evelyn," he said, which was not strictly part of the standard text but which Reverend Alcott allowed, "and I intend to spend the rest of my life proving it in ways large and small, because you deserve both. I will be here on the ordinary days and the hard ones, and I will always leave bread on the porch." There was a sound from the pews that was somewhere between laughter and tenderness, because several people in the church knew the story by now, and Mabel Greer was visible in the 2nd row with her handkerchief already out. Evelyn said her vows in a clear, steady voice, and at the last she added, "And I will always leave the door open." Reverend Alcott pronounced them married, and Patrick kissed her in the way he had kissed her since Christmas, with absolute gentleness and absolute certainty, and outside the cottonwood trees were flowering in the April sun. The celebration afterward was held at the church hall, and it was exactly what Mabel Greer had been wanting to organize for months, which meant it was excessive and warm and wonderful, with tables of food and dancing to the fiddle and the guitar, and everyone in Dusty Creek who could walk was there. Patrick danced with Evelyn 3 times, which for a man who had quietly indicated he was not a natural dancer was a demonstration of considerable devotion. They were not graceful precisely, but they were happy, and that was better. Alice Prout, Evelyn's best student, appeared at her side near the end of the evening with the slightly formal manner she adopted for important occasions and said, "I wanted to tell you that you are the best teacher I have had, Mrs. Dawson," using the new name with the particular deliberateness of someone who had been saving it up. Evelyn felt the warmth of that go all the way through her. They moved into the property Patrick had purchased north of town in early May, after 6 weeks of work that had involved what seemed like the entire male population of the Callaway ranch plus several men from town, because Patrick had the particular quality of being someone people wanted to help when he needed it. The old farmhouse had been rebuilt from the inside out practically. New plaster on the walls, new boards on the porch, a proper kitchen with a good stove, a bedroom with real windows, and a room off the hall that Evelyn immediately designated as a study with a shelf for her growing collection of books. The property had good soil and the reliable spring Patrick had mentioned, and they planted an ambitious garden that first summer. Evelyn kept a small plot of it for herbs and flowers, because she had decided that beauty was as legitimate a provision as food, and she intended to have both. She continued teaching, because the school board had confirmed her position permanently at the end of the spring term, and she had no intention of giving it up, and because the work was the best thing she had done professionally in her life. Alice Prout had made progress that year that put her ahead of most adults in the county, and Evelyn had quietly been writing letters to a women's college in Pennsylvania on Alice's behalf, because she thought Alice should know that a wider world was available to her. Patrick had taken on a different arrangement with the Cowboy ranch, working as a senior consultant rather than a full-time hand, which allowed him to manage his own land while still bringing in income. Frank Calloway, who was a pragmatic man and knew talent when he saw it, had proposed this arrangement himself, because having Patrick Dawson available on a consulting basis was worth more to him than having him full-time and resentful. The summer of their first year of marriage was golden and occasionally difficult in the way that first years are when two people are learning the specific rhythms of a shared life. They had arguments, not many but real ones, usually about decisions that mattered, about money or the land or the way the ranch arrangements should work, and they had learned early to have those arguments honestly and completely rather than letting them gather like weather and burst later. Patrick had a habit of carrying problems silently for longer than he needed to before speaking about them. Evelyn had told him, without irritation but clearly, that this was unfair to both of them, and he had acknowledged it and worked on it, which was one of the things she valued most about him, the willingness to identify something and change it. She had a habit of taking on more than she could do and refusing to ask for help until she was already overwhelmed. He had pointed this out with equal clarity and equal gentleness, and she had acknowledged it and worked on it too. They were good at taking each other's point, which was, they both understood, a rarer skill than it appeared. In the late summer of their first year, Evelyn suspected she was pregnant, and confirmed it as well as was possible in 1882 without a physician present by the criteria of the time, which were primarily the passage of weeks and certain undeniable physical changes. She told Patrick on a Thursday evening in September while they were sitting on the porch after supper watching the sunset color the plains, and his face did something she had not seen it do before, which was that all the composure of it simply dissolved, and what was underneath was so open and wondering and deeply moved that she felt her own eyes fill. He gathered her into his arms very carefully and held her, and neither of them said anything for a while. "Are you well?" he asked finally. "Are you feeling all right?" "I am very well," she said, which was mostly true. The mornings had been difficult for several weeks, but she was managing. "I am more than well." "I will ride to the county seat next week to see about the physician there," he said. "Dr. Morton, I am told he is good." "That would be sensible," she agreed. He tightened his arms around her slightly, and she felt him press his cheek against her hair, and the sun went down over the Texas plains in bands of amber and rose, and the night came on warm and fragrant with the last of the summer grass. Dr. Morton was indeed a capable physician, a bearded man in his 50s who had been practicing frontier medicine for 20 years and had strong opinions about proper nutrition and rest, which made him and Patrick natural allies. He confirmed the pregnancy and gave Evelyn a list of practical instructions with the businesslike competence of someone who had seen this situation many times and had no patience for either dramatic alarm or cavalier dismissal. She continued teaching through the fall term, which generated some comment from Archibald Finch, who seemed to feel that her condition and her professional role were incompatible in ways he struggled to articulate precisely. Evelyn invited him to articulate them precisely at length, in a meeting she requested at the school board office, and his inability to do so resulted in no action being taken. She took considerable quiet satisfaction in this. The winter was gentler than the previous one, or perhaps it simply felt that way because she was inside it differently, less alone, with Patrick home in the evenings, and the house warm and full of the domestic texture of a life properly lived. He still brought her coffee in the mornings, though the need had changed from what it originally was. He would bring it to wherever she was, at the kitchen table marking papers or at her study desk, or sometimes to the bedroom when the January cold made rising difficult, and set it down beside her with the same quiet care that had characterized the provisions on the porch. And she thought that this quality of his, the willingness to tend to her without making a performance of it, was one of the things she loved most completely about him. She told him this one morning in February, looking up from the papers she was marking, and he stood in the doorway of the study with his own coffee cup and looked at her with an expression of such uncomplicated happiness that she thought she could look at it for the rest of her life and not tire of it. Their son was born in April, on a night when the spring storms were moving through from the west, with the thunder rolling across the plains and the rain coming down straight and hard against the windows. Patrick was present, because he had been present through all of it, and Evelyn had told him with calm directness that she wanted him there, and Mrs. Holloway, the midwife from town, had raised an eyebrow but made no objection to having a husband who was useful rather than underfoot. He was born at midnight, strong and indignant about the whole process, with dark hair and the particular squashed red face of the newly arrived, and he filled the room with sound immediately. Patrick held him first, while Evelyn was being attended to, and the expression on his face was something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. He was looking at his son with an entirely new quality of emotion, something beyond what she had seen before, and his arms were as careful and steady holding the baby as they were in everything else. They named him James Robert Dawson, James for Patrick's mother's surname, her maiden name being James, and Robert for Evelyn's first husband, because she had loved Robert and he had been a good man and he had brought her to Texas, which had brought her to this, and she thought he deserved to be remembered in the name of something wonderful. Patrick had agreed to this without hesitation, which said everything that needed to be said about who he was. James was a good-natured baby, curious and observant from very early on, which Evelyn found entirely predictable given his parentage. Patrick was besotted with him in the thorough, practical way he was besotted with Evelyn, showing it not in excessive sentiment, but in the quality of his attention, the way he learned quickly what each cry meant, the way he spent evenings with James propped against his chest while he read, talking to him in the low, steady voice that had always been one of Evelyn's favorite sounds. The garden that summer was extraordinary. Everything had overwintered well, the soil was good, the spring was reliable, and Evelyn and Patrick both worked it with the combined skill of everything they had learned. She had an abundance for the first time, not just enough but genuinely more than enough, and she left portions at the doors of several elderly neighbors who were managing on limited means, doing it quietly and without announcement, and Patrick said nothing about this, but she noticed the quality of his expression when he saw her loading the basket. Alice Prout received a letter from the Women's College in Pennsylvania in August. Evelyn had written them a letter of recommendation of such thorough and specific quality that the admissions board had been compelled to respond with genuine interest. Alice arrived at the schoolhouse with the letter and a face that was trying very hard to be composed and not succeeding, and Evelyn sat down with her and held both her hands and they cried together in the empty classroom for a few minutes, which was perfectly appropriate. Alice Prout's parents were persuaded by a conversation between Evelyn, Patrick, and Frank Calloway who had a strangely influential voice in the community, that allowing their daughter to attend college was not a threat to the natural order but an investment. And Alice left for Pennsylvania in September with a letter of credit, arranged through the bank in the county seat, and a trunk of sensible clothes that Evelyn had helped her pack. She wrote to Evelyn every month, long detailed letters full of what she was learning and who she was meeting, and Evelyn wrote back with equal length and enthusiasm, and it was one of the ongoing joys of her years in Dusty Creek. The autumn of 1884 was a good season on the Dawson property. The land was producing well. Patrick's arrangement with the Callaway Ranch had stabilized into something genuinely comfortable and respectful. Evelyn was into her third year of teaching and had expanded the curriculum to include proper geography and basic natural sciences, which several parents had initially objected to, and most of them had come around on once their children started explaining how weather systems worked at supper. James was 18 months old and walking with the determined confidence of someone who has decided the floor is simply an obstacle to be overcome, and the house was full of the sound of a busy and contented family. There was a moment in November of that year, an ordinary Thursday evening, when Evelyn was at the kitchen table with James on her lap turning the pages of a picture book. Explaining each image in the careful, detailed way, she talked to him as if he were already capable of following the full argument, which Patrick suspected he largely was, and Patrick was by the fire cleaning the tack. The lamp was lit, the fire was warm, outside the wind was moving through the dry grass of the Texas plains with its particular western sound. Patrick looked up from what he was doing and looked at his wife and his son, and the simplicity and completeness of what he felt in that moment was something he recognized, with a kind of grateful astonishment, as happiness in its purest and most unadorned form. Evelyn looked up and caught him looking, and her expression was questioning. "I am just," he began, and then stopped, because he was still the man who found it easier to show things than say them. But she knew. She always knew. "Yes," she said softly, looking at him with those warm, dark eyes. "I know." James looked up from the picture book at the sound of his parents' voices and pointed at Patrick with the imperious certainty of a toddler and said, with great conviction, "Duh." Patrick set down what he was working on and came to the table and sat beside his wife and son, and James immediately transferred himself to his father's lap and returned to the picture book, now pointing at things and naming them in the fragmentary but enthusiastic language of the 18-month-old. Evelyn leaned her head against Patrick's shoulder, and he pressed his lips to her hair, and the fire crackled, and the wind moved outside, and the plains of Texas held them all in the vast, indifferent, beautiful dark. The following spring, Evelyn suspected she was pregnant again, which proved correct. She told Patrick in the same way, on the porch in the early evening, and he received it in the same way, with that quality of open wonder that she had decided was one of her favorite things to give him. He kissed her with the kind of tenderness that had not diminished over 3 years of marriage, but had in fact deepened and become more specific and sure. Their daughter was born in December of 1885, on a night that was cold but not stormy, quick, and uncomplicated by comparison to James's arrival. They named her Clara Ann Dawson, Clara for Patrick's mother, who had died 4 years prior but who Patrick spoke of with consistent love, and Ann for Evelyn's teacher, an elderly woman in Ohio who had first shown her what it meant to use your mind as a tool for living. James regarded his sister with the cautious scientific interest of a 2-year-old being presented with a new phenomenon, and within 2 weeks had decided she was satisfactory and became her most dedicated champion, a quality that persisted through their entire childhood and into their adult lives. Clara was from her earliest days the kind of person who would not be overlooked. She had Patrick's dark blue eyes and Evelyn's dark hair, and a temperament that combined his stubbornness with her precision, which Patrick observed privately to Evelyn would make her either a formidable teacher or a very good lawyer, and Evelyn said she did not see why it could not be both. Mabel Greer, who came to visit in the week after Clara's birth and sat in the kitchen drinking Evelyn's good coffee, with the satisfaction of someone surveying excellent work, said that it had all turned out exactly as she had always known it would. "And how had you always known?" Patrick asked, from his position by the window where he was holding a sleeping Clara with the same easy competence he had developed with James. Mabel looked at him with the expression of a woman who knows more about human nature than most people she has met. "The morning I saw you carry her basket from across the street," she said, "when she was too proud to ask for help and you were too decent to pretend you had not noticed. That is not the behavior of a man who is indifferent." "No," he agreed. "It is not." Evelyn, listening from the rocking chair where she was recovering with a cup of tea, felt the warmth of that story, her story, the way it had been seen by someone outside it and recognized for what it was. "You conspired," she said to Mabel, not accusingly. "I arranged an introduction," Mabel said with great dignity. "What happened after was entirely your own work. The years that followed were the kind that build a life." Patrick purchased a second parcel of adjacent land in 1887, expanding the property, and allowing him to maintain a modest but productive cattle operation that balanced with the farming and provided a stable income. Evelyn taught in Dusty Creek for 8 consecutive years, expanding the school from a single room to a 2-room building by 1888 as the town grew, and hiring an assistant teacher whom she trained with the same thorough care she gave everything. Several of her former students went on to further education, not just Alice Prout but 3 others, 2 boys and another girl, all of whom wrote to her for years after. Alice had become a teacher herself in Pennsylvania, and wrote with the kind of letters that showed a mind fully come into its own, which was exactly what Evelyn had hoped for. The town of Dusty Creek grew as the railroad's influence expanded, bringing new people and new commerce, and the Dawson property, which had once been at the edge of things, gradually became more central to the community in ways that Patrick had not specifically planned and managed well regardless. He was elected to the local Water Rights Committee in 1889, a position he undertook with characteristic quiet competence and the ability to stand firm under pressure that made him effective in negotiations about the creek rights that were increasingly contentious as more farms needed water. Evelyn was asked in 1890 to serve on the newly formed school board, and she accepted, because there was a certain satisfaction in being on the other side of the table from where she had once sat waiting for Archibald Finch to make up his mind. She used the position to advocate for higher teacher salaries, better school buildings, and the inclusion of more advanced subjects in the curriculum. She did not win every argument, but she won enough. On a September evening in 1890, when James was 7 and Clara was nearly 5, and the days were cooling into the perfect temperature of the Texas fall, Evelyn and Patrick were sitting on the porch of their house while the children played in the yard. The sun was going down the way it did on the western plains, in long bands of gold and amber that gradually deepened to red, and the cottonwood trees along the creek boundary of their land were beginning to turn yellow. James was explaining something at great length to Clara, who was listening with the concentrated attention she gave most things, and Evelyn watched them with the feeling she had learned to identify as a specific kind of joy, the kind that came from seeing things grow as they were meant to. Patrick's hand found hers on the porch rail, the way it always did, as natural as breathing. She looked at him, at the face she knew as well as her own now, the lines that had deepened at the corners of his eyes from years of sun, and the gray that had begun to come in at his temples, and the dark blue eyes that were the same as they had always been, steady and warm and entirely honest. "I have been thinking," she said, "about the first morning, when I found the bread on the porch and did not know who had left it." "What about it?" he asked. "I was so determined to manage by myself," she said. "I had decided that accepting help was the same as giving up, which was entirely wrong and also possibly the most stubborn position I have ever held." "It is competitive," he agreed, given some of your other positions." She laughed and he smiled, and the evening continued going down in its magnificent colors across the plains. "You changed how I thought about that," she said, "about what accepting help means, that it is not surrender, that it is just two people taking care of each other." "You did not need to be taken care of," he said. "You were managing fine." "I was managing," she said. "That is not the same as fine, as you very well know." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the children and the turning trees and the big western sky. "I noticed you because you reminded me of my mother," he said. "Not in your appearance, but in the way you were holding yourself together when everything was difficult. She had that same quality. Standing upright through things." "You never told me that," she said. "I am telling you now," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat together on their porch in the September evening, watching their children play in the last of the good light. James suddenly let out a whoop and ran in a large circle for no discernible reason, which Clara observed for a moment and then repeated, and they ran in circles together, laughing, in the long golden grass of the yard. Evelyn and Patrick watched them, and the contentment of that moment was complete and without qualification, the kind that does not require any additions or amendments, because it is already exactly what it should be. The years had given them everything that mattered. The land was good, the house was warm, the children were growing in the way that good soil and genuine love produced, curious and sturdy and kind. The town around them had grown and changed with the changing frontier, the wildest edges of it smoothing as the railroad and commerce and law came in more firmly. But what they had built on their own land, and in their own life, had its own quality of permanence that did not depend on the circumstances of the larger world. Patrick had given Evelyn a garden that worked, a house that was warm, and a life in which she was never again required to count her coins to the bottom of a pocket and skip meals to make them last. She had given him roots, a home that was full of books and learning and the specific warmth of a woman who loved with all of herself, and children who were every good thing from both of them. They had given each other, across 8 years of marriage, the quiet daily work of choosing each other again, in small actions and steady presence, in coffee brought without being asked, and doors left open and hands found in the evening on the porch rail. One evening in late autumn, when James was home from the small academy in the county seat where he was boarding for his schooling, and Clara was sitting at the kitchen table working through a mathematics problem with the same focused determination she brought to everything, and the house was warm and full of the smell of supper, Patrick found Evelyn in her study. She was writing a letter, and she looked up when he came in with the expression she always had when she was interrupted from deep concentration, slightly dazed and then warm, the transition from whatever world she was writing into and back to the present one. "Supper is ready," he said. "I will be there in one moment," she said. "And then, Patrick," he stopped in the doorway. "I want you to know," she said, with the direct simplicity she had always had, "that this is the life I would have chosen. If I had known at any point that this was available, this exact life, I would have come here for this." He looked at her for a moment in the lamplight of the small study with its shelves of books and its window looking out over the yard and the plains, and he said, "So would I, without a moment's hesitation." She rose and crossed to him, and he held her in the doorway of her study, and the house around them was full of light and warmth, and the sound of their daughter arguing cheerfully with her mathematics problem. And outside the Texas plains went on and on under the enormous dark sky, holding them all lightly in its wide, indifferent beauty. The bread on the porch had been the beginning of all of it, the first quiet gesture of a man who had decided to care, offered without strings or expectation, simply because she needed it, and he had the means and the will to help. It had been the first word of a language they had been building ever since, the language of two people tending to each other across the years, in all the ordinary and extraordinary ways that love expressed itself on the frontier in 1882 and every year after. And that language had no end that either of them could see. James came down the hallway and said dinner was getting cold, and Clara came out of the kitchen to add her agreement with the authority of someone who had been waiting patiently and was now at the limit of her patience, and Patrick and Evelyn separated and went to their family with the ease of people exactly where they belonged. The table was set. The lamp was lit. Outside, the Texas night was dark and wide and full of stars. They sat down together. They ate. And everything was, at long last and by their own good work, exactly as it should be.